Greetings to everyone. So we have a considerable number of folks join here. So I'm Shashidhar. So I'll be moderating this webinar today. So today we have this art of API testing, so which is co-hosted by QATTS and DevQA. So QATTS is one of the pioneering tool for a test automation platform, which is owned by Ram Yerneni. So he's kind of a product architect at QATTS, and he's also a kind of a founder and a CEO for IBS IT Solutions. And Ram has been into the business since nine plus years into this, and he has kind of bridging the gaps between the business and people with the technology. And currently he's solving many of the technological problems and doing the consulting with many of the industry leaders like HGS, QBE, Genfair, and NY. And I think we need to welcome Ram to start this presentation. And along with Ram, we have Amir, who is a lead QA consultant at Amido, and he's also a founder of Dev QA. He has an overall experience of 20 years in IT, and he's passionate about consulting, coaching, automation. And today we will have both Ram and Amir starting on giving some kind of an information which will be really helpful in our testing industries. And I think Ram, over to you. You can.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for taking time and joining to this webinar. So definitely, as Shashi said, I think, yeah, so it's a warm welcome for everyone. And as my co-host Amir, he has tons of experience. And his vision of seeing dev and QA as one thing has motivated him to start up his devqa.io. I think so. He brings, he tries to bridge the gap between the dev and the QA, and overall, producing an effective, the quality output products. So we have a few more joinings coming. Okay. Okay. Right. So in today's discussion, we're talking about APIs. So what is the APIs has been, there's a tremendous growth of use of APIs in the last 5 years or so, I think, right? So, and then today we want to talk about how that has transformed and how we effectively put an effective API strategy and effectively solve the QA's overhead of going for a regression testing in an effective manner. So today I'll be talking about a little bit about continuous testing and a little bit of TestOps, and then I'm going to briefly cover about the aspects of API testing and few challenges and few benefits that API testing will bring to us. And then I'll pass on to my colleague Amir, and Amir will talk about the little bit of API lingo and a little bit on the security side of the testing aspects of it. So over the last 4 years, we've been listening a lot about CI/CD kind of verbiage, right? From that space development, I said, okay, well, the moment something goes in directly, we want to deploy directly into the environment after without any hurdles. I mean, without any touch points, right? So obviously, that's very good for the business. So the moment the change is done, it goes into the deployment into our systems where it can be immediately tested, and then there is a lot of strategies in it. If something goes wrong, I can automatically roll back, and all that stuff is well established over the years, right? But one bottleneck that's been missing is, okay, how do we get the quality assurance getting into this, right? And that's where I think rapidly we need to do a quick test as well, right? As quick as we deploy, we need to also test it very quickly, and also we need to get results very quickly. And that's where the continuous testing will also come in play today, right? So that's, in a sense, I think it's a little bit lost, and the continuous development as deployments has gone forward, but continuous testing there is a big gap in catching up to that So one of the key aspects, one of the key considerations for any company to look into that is to invest their time in the API testing, and that will enable you guys any product releases to embrace the continuous deployment. Few of the things that we can achieve with this continuous testing is you can achieve great quality checks. You can put your regression testing again and again into it, and you can build a world-class product, and you can do a faster release rollouts. And even though today, I think if you do a continuous deployment, Again, someone has to test it, and then you'll get the result out, right? So officially you're not publishing it out, but if you enhance this continuous testing embedded into your continuous deployment, and that's where we can make a one step forward into that journey of continuous deployment, and making sure the moment the change is committed, it tested all through round and goes into the production with a bug-free software being released again and again, right? So moving on, right? So the continuous testing is very important in today's world, and we see how we gonna put that across, and what is the considerations that we need to do. Okay, so obviously over the years, right? So there's a traditional way of testing. You do there's some you create your test cases based on your requirements, and then you execute on an application that is typically a pre-prod or a QA kind of an environment that you deploy in that. And then once you get it, then you get the results, and if it's all good, then you put the production, and then the production again will bring back the some results kind of stuff, and then goes in a different cycle. Coming with the test tops, where we are fast tracking everything, there is no time for us to think in that way. We can't wait a phase by phase approach. The moment the build goes into the environment, we have to get on with it, and then immediately start testing on top of it, right? So that's where we have to see the test tops coming through. So, right, we have some more joins. Yeah. So we can see, right? So here on the right hand side, what you can see there, right? In the with the test tops, you have your requirements, and then the moment your requirement comes, it's just not about requirements as well, right? So sometimes you will get the user feedbacks. The moment user gives a feedback, obviously as a business, right, they would expect you to immediately put add it into the current sprint, right? So it's an evolving thing, right? So to adapt to all these things, right, so we need to be embracing the next level of testing approaches, wherein that instant result is given to us in a quicker manner, right? So that's the test ops, right? So moving on, right, to get to that stage of test ops, right, to so we have to change the we have to shift our testing approach towards the API. So if you look at the lot of world quality reports, and we have seen a lot of other things, right? And in that, right, so we have what we have there, right? There's only 17% of the companies are able to get their ROI invested that's invested onto the test automation. And that's quite low when compared to the efforts that went into it. Right? Now, obviously, one of the key difference that makes a huge difference, right? So most of the test automations today, or the tools which are there in the market, are primarily focused on your GUI base of testing, and that's where you spend a lot of time into it, because the moment you put a GUI, then there is a lot of challenges that comes through as well, and that's where we have to shift our test approaches towards the API. So we have the test shift left approach, where we shift our design approach from more focused from a UI based to API, and in fact reaching out to the requirement stage and design stage as well. So once we shift towards that part, so you are getting early defects identified, and then that subsequently will help you in improving your overall quality of the product. So shift left is very important in taking this approach. That's where you will eliminate most of uh, um, the minor issues that you will get with your developer mistakes kind of stuff, right? And then when you do a shift right, now there's the next level we have to do as well, right? That's not enough to get to that ultimate goal of getting your thing into continuous testing mode, right? So what does the shift right brings to us, right? So the shift right, as I mentioned before, with the new age testing methodologies, so you're going to shift from UI, and then, as I said before, the moment you put into production, the user behavior comes up with, and then people say, hey, I want to put quickly adapt to this quick scenario that came up in the production, right? So immediately that goes back as a requirement or a feature, and sometimes they directly ask the developer, hey, can you do fix it? Right? So all that feedback needs to be incorporated as well, right? So with the with not only just moving your focus onto the API side of it, but we also need to shift our focus onto how easily we can execute our test and how effectively we can reply back to our result, back to the dev team that okay, what's been passed and what's been failed. It's also equally important. So when you say shift right, then you need to also focus on how we can easily validate. How do we deploy these tests in a testing environment? How quickly we can execute that, how quickly we can get the results back the moment the engineer with more accurate information. And in this journey, I think that's where the API takes a major role. And that's where, if you in the last decade, the at least the 5 years, the application development methodologies has changed drastically. With the microservices architecture, there's a heavily user for mobile and web and uh, parallel UI interfaces being built. Investing your time more onto the UI interfaces, UI tests will be not so advisable. So we have to eliminate all the critical issues that will pose right within the API state. And APIs gives a very easy way of addressing these challenges. So
Ram, can we take a break and check if anyone has questions on this on the previous
sure.
slide?
Yeah, gentlemen, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask us, or you can just drop a comment in your comment section. We're quite happy to answer that. And also, as end of the session, also I think we can also do a scenario based kind of discussion. If you have any particular scenario in your organization that you are studying with, we'll be happy to take up that as a challenge, and we can also address it, and myself and Amir can give some advice in how best to tackle that situation. So we do have a few more joinings coming along. Right.
Yep. So I request all the attendees to use the reactions in the Zoom to make sure that if you have any questions, it's getting addressed by Ram.
Sure. Right. So coming to the testing pyramid, so we have seen it here, right? So we have seen the testing pyramid. Obviously, it's not in the right direction that you can see, right? So obviously, this is a, but unfortunately, believe it or not, accept it or not, but if you look at the reports by the Gartners or many other many other people, right? So there's a lot of emphasis going on the UI based test automation. Even if you ask yourself, if it is a normal QA people, right? So most of the manual testers, they start doing testing on the UI rather than the API, right? So immediately the build comes in. Okay, let me log in and I check few things on the do a smoke test on the UI, right? So before that, if we can do the automation of the API, right? So that's where we need to we recommend to shift that into a right way of testing pyramid, where you focus more on the unit testing. This has been pretty much been taken over to the developments now. Now we're calling the software development in test, and they're doing pretty much most of the unit testing. And then you have the component test, then you have the integration testings, right? All that can be pretty much nowadays is completely packaged as a APIs, integrated into API testing. And once we go deeper into the API testing, that's where we can put this into the continuous testing without any dependencies on the UI. That gives you a faster results, right? Coming to the benefits of API testing, right? um, there is so you can access the complete testing, right, without a user interface. Means you don't need a real browser to span and or headless browser to start doing exactly what a user imitates, right? But if you look at the issues as well, most of the issues, right, if anything like a CRUD operation issues, or it could be any business logic not giving you a right result, or say for example if it's an insurance and you're not getting a right price, any of these scenarios, right, is pretty much UI is not controlling. That's all controlled by your backend APIs. So if you can put more things on that, right, and then it's you can benefit a lot in getting the results in a quicker manner, and especially in the testing of the APIs, right? So you don't have to really deploy the UI application. You don't have to create a big virtual machine to span up your test, right? Without any user interface, you can start doing the testing, and most of the core functionality can be easily evaluated there, right? And then time effective window. Typically, again, once you give a release, right? So typically, for you to do a single test, it's going to take quite some time to go through all the number of screens together. But if I call those sequence of, let's say, 5 or 6 APIs, underlying APIs in one shot, we can just get it in less than few seconds. We can able to complete that, right? So therefore, the time taken for completing an API testing is considerably reduced when compared to the traditional UA-based testing. And moving on, reduced or reduced the risks and faster time to market. So again, as I said before, with the API, you can test all the core business logic. Once you do that, then pretty much you can cut down most of the business critical functionalities. That means you are avoiding all the risks. If there is an issue in the UI, maybe it could be alignment issue or small issues. But if it is, I think with the API, it is where the financial implications will be there, or data corruption could be there. So if you test the APIs first, then you are literally reducing all that risk of your business risk, that you're introducing a serious bug into the production environment. And then tests are very stable. If you look at most of the automation tests, right? So could be using a Selenium or Appium, whatever the drivers you choose to use. They have a lot of issues in terms of the page loading time, for example. If there is an issue in the UI, your test may fail sometimes, right? Or if there's a small UI change which has not been properly communicated with the team, the test could be failing, right? So there's a lot of things will be there. But if you do with the API testing, it's a very stable. You don't have any of these noise kind of an issues that will uh, corrupt the testing process. They are very stable because they don't have any other dependencies. It's just a binary. You hit it, you get a response back. If you're getting a good response like 200, then you are good. If anything else, that that's not right. So it's very clear for you what is a pass test and what is a fail test. And then obviously, because it's not too much of overheads in putting this together, it will be very low maintenance as well. But overall, Mantra, I think the easy integrations, right? With all the integrations can also be easily tested without much of a hassle. We have a few more joinings. So, yeah, so with the easy integrations, you can integration testings can be done very easily with UI and right. So you can combine the API test and UI test to make it a successful test strategy. And it's a technology independent. So what does that mean is you don't have to be relying on any, let's say, if it's, UI, there is a technology dependency, right? So, and then you need to automate that. Again, you need to get a Selenium kind of an expert, for example, if it is a mobile interface, you need to get a mobile kind of an expert. So you don't have to, with the API testing, you don't have to do any of that. Right? It's very easy to start doing the testing. So, yeah. So moving on, so now we have to go to the core of an API. So what is that we can test on the API, and what levels we need to structure these, or put it in to get into a right strategy of API testing, right? So typically when you take an API, so we start with the basic checking. The basic checking includes, okay, am I getting a right response code or not? Okay, am I getting my JSON structure properly or not? Or the basic values of it are coming correctly or not? So that's a very high level check that we'll do. But that's not enough. When you do for the automated API testing, we have to add more to it. We can go beyond and check the boundary values to make sure that all the different scenarios are covered properly, and you can test the user scenarios. If the user works differently, then you can test all that. And then the additional business logic, right? So once an API is taken, you can focus core onto the core purpose of the API. Why is it done, and what was the purpose of the API? And then you can test it in that particular focused on that individual API. Test all the possible combinations that may come across for this on an individual API before you move on to the next level of API testing. These are all covered in the individual API testing. And moving on, right? So we have the user behaviors. Often now, if you look at the user behavior, you may think that it's only on the UI you will get this, API you will not get. But any action that is performed on a UI has a underlying API call as well, right? So again, by doing all that, chaining of those API sequencing, all your functionalities put together in a sequence of APIs, right? So if whatever the UI takes 5 or 6 steps, right? Eventually you can put that 5 or 6 steps in a sequence of API calls to make sure the same functionality, whatever is being tested on the UI, can easily be tested from APIs as well. So as I said before, the UI test may take around uh, at least 5 to 10 minutes. That can be achieved within less than 5 seconds. That's the speed that you can get with this. And
Ram,
integrations again.
before
Sorry.
you go to the next slide, we have certain questions from people.
Sure. Yeah.
The
Right,
first question is from Michael.
yeah. Automated through CI/CD via scripts. How do you handle randomized data or failed that materialize due to scaling? Right. So again, this comes as your test strategy, right? So there's a different levels of testing that I was talking about, right? So again, see there's a you have your when you scale up, right? When you scale up, obviously that's kind of a more of a performance and load kind of a testing, right? So that is opted for more at a infrastructure level, how you need to span that. Or sometimes the information is not, if it is a microservices, all the containers is not, sharing the same information. Those kind of stuff, right? So that you for the obviously for performance testing you can use JMeters. Definitely is one of the best thing to do, right? But again, here what we're talking about is first we need to get the functionality right. Once the functionality is right, then definitely we can, on top of it, you can definitely add these performance testing, and there's a number of tools that are there in the market which actually can help you that. But my important point, what I'm trying to say there, right, is sorry, we have a few more joinings coming along. Yeah. So that should be tested in a different silo. The scale, the and JMeter is definitely one of that. But we can also mix up that with JMeter kind of thing with your functional testing, because in the functional testing you also have the real user scenarios. If we can use and leverage that into your JMeter kind of a scenario, that gets you a better and effective results. Usually, typically, when I have seen JMeters kind of stuff, okay, I have these two, my APIs are critical, and I want to just more focus on these two APIs to get more of my to make sure that I create enough load on that, right? Sometimes that is not always right approach, so you may have to put uh, uh, more APIs into your JMeter kind of stuff.
Ram, there is a comment from the audience that your voice is going a little fast.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
No problem.
Okay.
So moving on, we have the second question from Deepak Rawat. It's more like a comment from him, exactly my thoughts on randomized data. So he's trying to agree on your point. And from Rajat Goel, so he has another question saying that
Testing API gives enough confidence, but what if the UI code has some glitches to pass the response? See, well, we are not saying that you should be stopping the UI testing, right? So UI testing will also be there, but the before we go to the API UI testing, but as my understanding across the industry today, and even the Gartner reports, and there's a number of world quality reports, a number of companies has been published. They say that a lot of is being done on the UI testing, but not enough is done on the API testing. So UI testing has to be done, and there is enough tools to get you a scalable and a reliable results on the UI testing as well. But before we go that, so you also need to put enough thing on the API testing, right?
Sorry, can I just add to that? That
Yeah.
the purpose of testing at each layer is different, right? So at the API layer, we're really testing the functionality of the components, so inputs and outputs. Likewise, there are some some functionalities that we cannot test at the API layer. For example, cookies or session management, which are stored by the browser. And now the type of testing that you do, or the purpose of testing that you do at each of these layers is different.
Yeah, very rightly said. This is all about the what is the scope of that testing, and what is that you're gonna achieve with that testing. So that has to be clearly defined. Again, one of the one of the key feature, right? Why some of the test automations will not being successful is because the stakeholders don't have a complete understanding of the what is that being achieved. Now magically my all my the quality goes up, right? So that's not usually the case. It's about how effectively you put your strategy, how each level, as Amir said, each level you have to define your goals properly, and you have to do in the right way of automating it to get a faster results. Okay. That functionality was removed. Okay. Okay.
Sorry, that was a comment to an earlier question. Can we use Selenium for API testing?
Got it.
I think in the early versions of Selenium you could, but not anymore. So.
Okay, good. Right, moving on. Right, so yeah, so I think almost done. Complete my stuff. Yeah, once the your behavior and sequencing, all that is being done, the next part you'll be going through is the, again as mentioned, performance, security, compliance, all that kind of tests will be done. Right. So saying that, right, so I will hand it over to my colleague Amir. Amir, you can you can start sharing your screen.
Cool. Thank you for that, Ram. Very insightful. Let me just share my screen. Okay. Can you all see this?
Yeah, we can see, Amir.
Yep, I trust you all do. Okay, so it's a nice continuation from Ram's talk on API testing. So yes, I mean, the stuff that we check at the APIs are obviously a lot more functional. At the UI layer, we tend to focus more around user scenarios, like more like an end-to-end sort of journey through a web application. Whereas the point of API testing is literally just making sure that each of these individual components work functionally, and then when they go and we build a system of APIs that we also do the integration between the APIs. So if we just imagine a fictional web application, you've got this 3-layer architecture. You've got the UI, and then you've got the centerpiece, which is the APIs, and then a data store, now a database or flat file, or where the data is coming from. Now, each of these APIs could be communicating with, let's say, third-party APIs that we probably have or have no control over with. So obviously, there's that interaction between the testing of the APIs. But really, what I really want you guys to get out of this session is that I've been kind of fortunate enough to have been in the testing industry for about 15 years now, and I've had the privilege to see how the testing has evolved from the old days of waterfall, V-model, and now kind of agile, DevOps, and now DevSecOps. And I've seen how the role of the tester has changed, and it's where, as Ram was alluding to earlier, where it was just only before we were only focusing on running everything through the UI, even functional testing and everything through the UI. We're now expected to know API testing. I think, throughout my interviews, I really find it difficult to find candidates who understand API testing, who understand API lingo, who understand HTTP, for example. And the aim of this session is literally to just give a brief overview of what you're dealing with when you're testing an API. And the first thing is, obviously, we have to know HTTP. We have to know how the web communicates, how the components in a web application communicate with each other. So, web application, they run on HTTP client. So we have to understand how each of these various components, from when you send a request on a web browser to when the data goes through a series of layers and communicates with the database to fetch the right result out. How is this communication established between each of these components? And when we are talking about API testing, essentially we're talking about endpoints. Now, what is an endpoint? It's essentially a URL that takes a request and serves a response. Now, the response could just be empty, which has got nobody, or it could just give you a bunch of stuff that you need to analyze or parse through. When we send the request, how do we send it? It could either be a get, a post, or put, patch, delete. Get is to fetch a resource. Post is obviously to create a resource. Put is to update, patch is to update, delete, as the name suggests, is deleting a resource. Request headers. So what goes on a request? So I'm talking about, when we send a request, what actually goes to a request. So if you imagine a request, so it's composed of a request header, a request body, and then obviously the method that you're communicating. The method being get or a post or a put. Anything to do with authorization or content type, anything that, for example, content type HTML or content type JSON or whatever, that all goes into your request headers. The query parameters. Now, these only come in play when we send a GET request. Now, when we want to send a GET request with some parameters, ideally, this is how we frame it. So it's a list of name value pairs, and we are asking the resource what we want to get. So in this example here, I'm sending a GET request to a resource, and I'm saying, well, my name is Amir. The company I work for is Amido, and years of service is 3. Get me the profile. Request body. Now, these are normally when you send a post or a put or a patch. It normally takes a form of JSON, although in some old instances it could be XML. And you can construct your payload. That's another keyword that I've kind of forgot to mention here, but it's essentially a payload, a request body that you send to a server. And by the same token, you can get a payload. That means you get a response back from the server. And then, as Ram said earlier, the first thing that you normally do is the response status code. 200 block, meaning it's okay. 300 blocks, 301, 302, 303s. These are doing redirections. 400 blocks. Typically, this is your request not being valid. So it's a user request issue. So unauthorized and unauthenticated. So 401 being unauthenticated, 403 not authorized. 500s are literally the stuff that you get back from the server not behaving properly. So, for example, when the server is down, or when the server is down, or the connection cannot be established. In some instances, you might get an internal server error, which is 500. And then what do you check when you get a response? Obviously, you have to analyze the full thing. So there are some variables and values in the response headers that you need to study and see whether they contain what you expected. Response body, let's say if the response body comes out as a JSON, is it the right schema? Is it the right, does it contain the right fields? Does it contain each of those fields? Does it contain the right value? And essentially, these are the things, these are the language of API testing. When we are talking about API testing, these are the essential things that, that we have to be familiarized with. Going on to the next slide. Sorry, I'm just trying to get my, right. So how do we construct API test? Obviously, now we've talked a lot about the lingo of the APIs, but how do we construct an API test? Now, from my own experience, the one thing that I challenge or used to challenge and sometimes still challenge with is JSON pathing. So you really have to understand your HTTP, and you really have to understand JSON and how to parse a JSON response. Now, JSON arrays, JSON objects, nested arrays, nested objects, you can get really some complex JSON responses, and you really have to know how to parse or how to use JSON path essentially to narrow your way down to get to the fields that you want to verify or the values that you want to verify. Now, so I would say, understand your HTTP, understand JSON and JSON path. These are the essential things that will get you down the API testing really quickly. Now, typically we analyze the requirements using a Swagger or API spec to understand or to make ourselves familiar with the nature of the request responses of an endpoint. What are the mandatory fields? What are the optional fields? What fields are we talking about? And then once we have a good grasp of the actual APIs, then we can start to prepare our requests, feeding in request headers, request data. Now we can always use like Postman or Insomnia to create these requests and then analyze the response before we get on to automating our understandings. So essentially, anyway, you do an exploratory test of the API first before you automate your tests. Now, once you execute, obviously, you need to then analyze the response. The first thing being the status code. Does it come back with the right status code? The ones that 200, 400, 500. Does it contain the correct response headers and response bodies? And I just mentioned earlier, you fetch data. Normally, you would fetch a data from an API call, and then you extract the responses and you feed it into your next API call. This is called request response chaining. This is when you want to simulate like a user journey through a system, because you might be calling several APIs along the way. And for example, you first call the authentication server to authenticate yourself, and you get a token. Then you need to feed that token into your next header request with some additional parameters into your other sort of get me now that I'm authenticated and I've got a token, now get me the profile of this user. Yes, and some sort of common tools that that you would normally use. I mentioned Postman and Insomnia. Karate is by far the best tool out there at the moment. It is so capable, and it just works. This is what you expect from a tool to work, and it just literally just works. If you haven't come across this, do a search on Karate DSL, and you'll be amazed by its capabilities. It's only like 4 years old. It hasn't been out a long time. If you're within the Java space, Rest Assured is a good alternative, or I think is Rest Sharp for our .NET colleagues. Good old curl is always a quick and dirty way of checking request responses, and also Burp, which is mostly used during the API security testing. Any questions so far, or just put them in the chat, or we'll attend to it later. Now I want to move on to the API security testing. Now obviously security testing has been a very hot topic, and it keeps getting hotter as we go through the years. We see it on the news, we see it on the web that things are being hacked left, right, center, and there is a shortage of security professionals, and everyone's kind of literally focusing on security. This list you see on the right, it's actually coming from OWASP Top 10 API security list. So if you are not familiar with OWASP, again, just Google, and they provide a lot of insight into web application security testing, of which API is a big thing at the moment. So I'm going to be just talking about these 10 different vulnerabilities, let's say, and actually, how do we test these? How do we test for these vulnerabilities? Because it's good to talk about API security and what it does, but it's really difficult to come across an example that actually tells you how to test for each of these various vulnerabilities. Now, at the core of any security is the CIA triad, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And normally, users are trying to access a resource which they're not authorized and they're not allowed to, or they are accessing a resource which they're trying to access someone else's record, for example, or they try to DDoS a system, or bring it down and kill all the resources, so the application doesn't have enough resources to run. So it's literally just when we are talking about API security is a user accessing resources when they're not allowed to, and then performing actions when they're not allowed to. Like, for example, okay, now I am a valid user, I have been authenticated, but can I delete other users, for example? So, that's I have gone through the authentication, but authorization is now failed. So I think, as QAs, we really have to bring the API security testing as part of our routine functional testing. So it's no longer good enough to say, well, security is someone else's responsibility, and I don't have knowledge, or it's too complex. Actually, when you think about it, when you look at some examples, they're not really complex at all. We're not talking about trying to hack into a network security or anything like that. So it's all about what you already know about APIs. It's just having that mindset of how it could be misused. So with that, I'm going to go through each of these top 10, and we'll probably, well, we'll talk about it and give examples of how to test for these things. Sorry, clicked on the wrong button. So first one, broken object level authorization. Now this talks about users who are not supposed to access, let's say, another person's record. So for example, this is my user and this is my user ID, so 567, and I can fetch my own personal info. And this is all exposed in the URL, right? This is a GET request, and I can fetch my personal info, and this is my ID. Now, if I'm clever enough and I go and play around with this value, then I can see that I can actually get the personal info of another person. And again, you know, that it's not really complex. It's just knowing how to hack around your API with data and requests. And even, you know, it doesn't need to be as a GET request. If you open up your developer tools and examine the requests that are being sent when you make a request on your UI, you could see what information is being sent through the headers. So in this case, you know, the header could be X user ID 567. What if I change the X user ID to 568? Am I able to retrieve another person's info? And, you know, being personal info is probably will get you into the PII, so personal information identification information, which is obviously needs to be secure. And a lot of the times this happens because the server relies on the parameters that have been sent by the client. And if there is not enough checks around the requests, then we fall into this trap of being able to expose some endpoints that can be misused. Next one, broken user authentication. Now this thing focuses around account creation and the flows around forgotten password and how we actually sign in. Now, typically the things you would check for is how do we store passwords in our data store? Are they hashed? Are they salted? Or what algorithm do we use to hash the passwords? Are we using a weak algorithm or a strong algorithm? What are the ways that we can request our forgotten passwords, for example? Are there any hacks around the actual workflows? I mean, sometimes you can register yourself, and then if you know your user ID, sometimes you need to click on a link in an email, and that email then sends a request to say, well, this person is authenticated. But if you just give a bogus email and then fetch the link that is emailed, then you can just replay the request and just let yourself in without having to authorize your email. I mean, are we exposing passwords or tokens through the URL? You know, these are very standard things that we can check, and we don't need you know, a security certificate or years of experience in security testing to check for these things. One big thing is around, am I able to brute force myself into an account, right? So I mean, I can run a script that tries to log into an account with I don't know, a dictionary list of username passwords. If we don't lock the account after, let's say, 3-5 attempts, then again we're exposing our system to brute force and credential stuffing. So, you know, it's just being mindful of how things can be misused and how we can address these issues. Now, it's worth saying that although these slides talk about what to test, it doesn't go into how to harden your system. I think that's above and beyond the scope of this presentation. Next one is the excessive data exposure. Now, suppose we send a request to get a response back, and we rely on the front end to do a filter and just display what is supposed to be displayed, right? So a lot of the times the front end just sends a request, and then the back end, the endpoint, just sends out the whole object, and then it relies on the front end to then have to extract relevant information and display it on the UI. Now, one reason for this could be that instead of the front end sending multiple requests to get to fetch multiple data, the backend says, well, here you go, there's the whole object, just do what you want with it. But the problem with that is that if you look at the response, if you look at your developer tools and examine the response, you would see that, you know, there's some, although the front end says welcome Daz, which is a nickname for Daryl, you would see that there's a whole bunch of other things that are potential that can potentially be used to hack the system. I know the user ID is this. I know that this is a role of an admin, and you know, all other sort of PII issues, you know, date of birth, email. But on the front end, all I'm seeing is this. But if I literally look under the hood, I see that there's this whole bunch of information. So it's making sure that we're not overexposing a lot of details, and we only expose what the front end needs. Now, this issue is kind of being addressed to some extent by GraphQL, because GraphQL, one of the benefits is that you only respond with what is being requested. So for example, here, if my request says, okay, give me only the nickname and first name, that's what I would get and nothing more. Moving on swiftly to lack of resource and rate limiting. Now, this is about making sure that we have enough controls in place so that our system doesn't get DOSed or DDoSed. Now, when you talk about when you think about DDoS, you probably are thinking about like 1,000 people are hammering your system from different locations all at the same time, which is true. But another way it can be DDoS is by overloading your requests. So if I have a page that brings out a list of, let's say, 20 products, can I increase that to like 2,000? So I'm putting pressure on the system, and a lot of memory and a lot of CPU usage is being used to fetch 20,000 records and display them all in one page. Now, can I sort of play around with these values? And what happens if I put like, you know, -1 or page -1? What do I get? And then, you know, let's assume that you upload an image, and then the service goes away and then creates thumbnails of different sizes. So if I upload a very, very large image, first of all, are we allowing from the front end, are we allowing a maximum file upload? And if so, what is it? If not, I could be just uploading a really large file, and then because the system is overworking to create all these thumbnails, it could essentially kill off their resources available. And I guess it's worth pointing out that don't be fooled by what you can do from the front end. Now, a lot of the times you see a form and you say, well, there's some JavaScript restrictions that don't allow you to input some characters or whatever. You can easily bypass that by knowing what the endpoint is being called. What does the request structure looks like, and you can replay that in a Postman or in some other tool, and you just completely bypass the UI. So this is why there needs to be a huge emphasis on API security testing, because we shouldn't just let the front end deal with requests and responses. Next one, the broken level authorization. I think it's this one. No. So as we are playing around with these requests and responses, can I fool the system to believe that I'm an admin, for example? So if I just hit this endpoint with user and some some ID, what if I just change the GUID with admin? Can I get to the admin portal, or does it even respond with a valid URL? Because if it does, then I know it's a valid URL, and I can sort of find my way around finding out what I need to serve to that endpoint. And as I mentioned earlier, when I'm authenticated as a valid person, it's all good. But can I do malicious activities? Like, can I send a delete user with the token that I have? So I've authenticated myself and I've got a valid token. Can I use that token to then do malicious activities like delete users, delete databases, whatever? And it's worth mentioning that you should check that this Swagger is not exposed. So in your dev environment, you might refer to your Swagger to see what request responses are. But it's also essential not to expose this in the production environment, because that would then open up things for hackers to understand your system. Mass assignment. So I can send a request, and this is a valid request, name John, age 40. Can I append role admin into that? So if I have a good insight into the API structure, can I assign more than what is required from let's say the front end? So again, I might have only two fields that says name and age, but then if I replay that in Postman, can I add any additional field that could potentially have side effects into this? So here I can just make myself as an admin if I can update with a put request. And then likewise here, like I can just say, well, yes, I'm authenticated. Yes, and I didn't even need to click on a link on an email that was sent to say, well, have you authenticated? as a means of authenticating yourself. Security misconfigurations is really talking about how you secure your system. Are we exposing credentials in our Git repository? Like, for example, sometimes we, during our test, we might be hard coding some username passwords, and we submit that to Git, not knowing that people can search through repositories and fetch these things. Are we using outdated libraries, or are we having open ports in our application? Which we should only be opening ports that are used for communication and nothing more. But do we actually check for that has been done, or are we just assuming that the developers knew that to open port 80, but they also open port, I don't know, 123 or whatever. Check security headers. Again, don't just go by what is in the request bodies. Always check the request headers and see what information is there, either of the request and response. And also try to create an error scenario to see what error message comes back, or what is contained in the error message. Because sometimes there is some information that can be useful to hackers when you look at the error messages. Injection, literally talking about SQL injection, and are we allowed, or does the application how does it handle SQL injections? And if you're using NoSQL, can I do something like this? So this is a NoSQL field, like parameter. Like, can I delete all the booking IDs that the ID doesn't equal to 678? So it's essentially, if I'm able to do this, then that means it's going to delete all the records in the database whose IDs is not equal to 678. And this is quite interesting because, as I said earlier, even though the front end might have some checks in place to not allow you to input malicious scripts into the form fields, but can I send this in my JSON payload as I'm replaying the request, because essentially there's no JavaScript anymore. And how does the backend now deal with this scenario? Am I able to actually store this in a database so that when a user fetches this record, they'll, this is interpreted as a HTML, and then if that's successful, then you can do a whole lot of other evil stuff. Improper asset management. So again, you might be using your dev URL to test, but then your configuration, when you go to production, is your production environment still pointing to dev? Have you checked that all the configs are now pointing to your production instance? Or are you still hitting or fetching data from your dev environment? And again, so sometimes be careful with the version 1s and version 2s and version 3s, because sometimes there's a bug in version 1 which is fixed in version 2. But then if I'm still able to access my endpoint by versions, I can still, do my evil things from the previous version and, put things in the database or access things from the database. So just make sure that when you have a bug fix in your latest version, that all the previous versions cannot be accessed. Improper asset management. That's what we discussed. And the last point, insufficient logging and monitoring. So as with everything, it's really essential to know what is going on with your system. So we should have proper logging in place. We should log all the activities that are happening so that if an intrusion happens, we know where to look for, and obviously we need to analyze the logs. If a system goes down, do we get alerted? Like if we are being DDoSed, do we have a means of alerting the relevant people that our systems are now down and it's not responding to real traffic from serving valid traffic? So we got some monitoring in place. We got to be alerting the right people. Again, these are all comes from the QA having to have knowledge of these things and then remind the team. Now, we know we're not saying that the QAs should be doing these things, but at least the QAs should highlight the risks and should allow the team or alert the team know about these things so that any other responsible person could pick up these tasks and deal with it. And that brings me to the end of my API security covering the OWASP top 10 list. I hope that was useful. I'm going to hand back to Mac or Sashi, who can then start taking your questions. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, thanks Amir and Ram for the wonderful session. So we are happy to answer the questions. So whoever has a question, I see a lot of questions in the chat box right now. Feel free to raise your hand so Ram can unmute and you can ask the questions. All you have to do is raise the hand.
If you're raising your hand, literally raising your hand, we can't see anyone. So you got to use the reactions.
Okay, Michael has a question. And
Michael has a few questions, right? Probably, we can start answering that also. I thought unmuting him would be a wonderful thing to do. Thanks, Jagdish. Thanks for the thing. Probably, Michael, we can unmute you. Can you just ask the question up, please? I think Michael.
Sorry about that. Yeah, there we go. Let's see here. I guess the latest question was like with versioning of the API.
Yeah, I can see Michael raised the hand. Can you just open? Can you unmute him?
Yeah, Michael is speaking. We can hear him.
Yeah, sorry, I should be unmuted now. But the last question was basically with the versioning of the API. Isn't it kind of, I mean, if you have dependent parties like B2B type functionality where they may not have the resources to update dependent API calls, but there may be a bug, shouldn't you backpatch previous versions? If you found a fix in version 2, it shouldn't be too difficult to apply that to version 1 and carry that forward. But I don't know. I don't know what the best practice is on something like that.
Yes, that's right. So when you are in production environment, normally you're only moving forward, right? So you make a bug fix and you make sure that previous versions can't be accessed. But sometimes this happens during like mass refactor or a brand new feature that you sort of move from version 1 into version 2, and a lot of things have changed. And then as it happens as a side effect, some of the previous things can still be accessed. Some of the previous endpoints can still be accessed by just manipulating the URL. And it's just making sure that we can't access or let's put it another way, we can only access the latest and greatest, and there's no other way of being able to access any previous.
It would just be an enforcement on anybody dependent on any service.
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay. What about the other question was like when you like host from the cloud, like if you had a cloud formation script to spin up an environment in your production and you specify policies against resources, is that is going to just basic that base level and then having more of a general error handler, a global error handler enforce those policies, or should the API specifically go into specifying policies and controlling accesses through its own mechanism, like identity server or something, to that effect?
Yes. So I guess a lot of that boils down on how you have architectured your infrastructure and what
it's kind of a multi-layered approach, I guess.
Yeah. So what responsibilities do you assign to which layer, right? So it really, I mean, I wouldn't say there is one way or one good way or bad way, or one best way of doing it. It really goes down on how you architect your infrastructure. But what I would say is that always have a list of what ifs, like how can this, like, if you do like threat modeling, for example, how can this system be misused, and what scenario, what errors does it expose, and at which layer. And another sort of good way of doing this is resilience testing, whereby you have load going through your system, maybe with a JMeter script or something, and then you start taking services offline and see how does the system behave when like the database
tearing down different parts of it.
Exactly. Okay. Yes. Yeah.
The other question, I guess, was part of injection. Like I know a long time ago I saw a vulnerability in .NET where they would be able to pass Unicode and it would stream through that encoding, whether it was in the body or the query string, I can't remember, but it would execute then on SQL Server, even though they had a different they had a God, what was it called? I forgot. Parameterized queries. So I mean, that is that still kind of a threat, or is that even, am I in the ballpark there?
Well, it really depends on the age of the system. I guess the modern DB systems are probably have got some level of security in place. As with, let's say the Chrome browser is already got some things which you used to do like a few years back, and you can't do anymore. But yeah, I mean, you'd be surprised by how easy some of these hacks are, and literally, you have these script kiddies just doing things, and it all comes down to us not being aware, not having the awareness, and not taking enough effort to secure our systems. I think the first and foremost thing is having the awareness of, yes, your system can be hacked. Yes, there are hackers out there for whatever reason, malicious, fun, whatever. But they need but what we need to take have that awareness and study.
Okay, yeah. Sorry, that's 3 questions. I appreciate your time, and it's really good presentation.
Thank you. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Michael. I hope it answered. So we also have Varun question. So Varun raised a hand. Can you unmute Varun, Ram?
Yeah, they can unmute themselves. Yeah.
Yeah. Hi, Amir and Ram. First of all, thanks for a wonderful session. First of all, I have 2 questions. First one is Selenium can be considered as an API because it can be dealt with Java, where Java consists of various Java archival files which will be operating on a daily basis. So that is my first question. Like Selenium can be called as API or not?
So you mean the actual Selenium itself being called as an API, or can Selenium do API testing?
Like my best question was Selenium itself can be called as an API or not?
As a subject of an API, yeah. So the API communication, right? So whatever the communication we do from a Selenium programming, end of the day goes as an API to the browser, right? So that's how the communication happens. But that's more into deeper under the bonnet kind of stuff. But if you're testing your product, I mean, that's something Selenium is doing. Do you really want to do that kind of testing, right? So that's way deeper in, right?
Yes, Ram. And second question is like, can we use any decryption and encryption methods while we are dealing with username and password in our scripts, or we can directly hard code our values in the script?
Well, it all depends on how your API is set up, right? So if the API is enabling a decrypted format, then you have to give it. So end of the day, you are testing from the other side of it. So whatever the developer is given, now that's what you need to do. From a testing as a practice, when you're doing your automation scripting and exposing those passwords in the API in an unprotected manner is not a right way to do it. So if you're testing your test bed and keeping your open the passwords exposed, without encrypting and keeping in a secured way, that's not a right practice to do. So I would recommend to have something in the passwords, all the password management separately managed, where it's all encrypted, and at the time of usage, it will be decrypted and posted back to the API.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Ram. And
Any questions? Feel free to unmute yourself and you can speak up.
Hello, Amir. Sandeep this side. So, yeah, I want to know that I'm the very beginner for the API testing point of view. Although I have worked on the different tools like Selenium, web-based application, and other window-based application, Test Complete, Eggplant, and so for API testing, what you suggest to me that how I need to prepare myself for learning point of view and for the get into it.
Yes, so thanks for the question. So the first thing I would say is one of the things I pointed out in this slide is to really grasp HTTP, to understand how the web works, how requests and responses, how do you construct the request? And you can use Postman, which is a application, and it's got a user interface, and it's really easy to get a feel of what because with API, you don't have an interface, you don't know how things look, you're only dealing with data and pure data, and so I would say as a first instance, play around with Postman, understand the nature of request responses, HTTP, what are these status codes, and then start maybe just picking up. I don't know whether you know any scripting language or programming language, but if you know Java, for example, you can start writing, with rest assured, or not even that, pick up karate, go through the tutorials, which is very self-explanatory. And it is actually aimed at QAs or testers who don't have a great deal experience in coding, and it just makes things a lot simple. So I would say, with those two, Postman and karate is way to go.
Okay, thank you.
Good luck.
Yeah, thanks.
Any other questions?
Any other questions?
Hello.
Yeah.
Yeah, hello. I have a question that usually in REST APIs, the response format is of JSON type, but in what all scenarios or in what all situations, XML will be the best as a response response format body.
So you're saying when will be the XML be the best format as when you're defining the API?
Yeah.
So when you're creating it, developing an API, and then you're saying when is the best for the XML to be as an output?
Yeah, right. Like in response, whenever a response is coming there, in certain cases, there are multiple formats to be supported, like XML, JSON, or sometimes CSV. And so in what all cases, like you can set XML as the default format.
See, I think when say API, right? So when you are defining the API, it's purely dependent on who is consuming it, right? So when you are giving your response, and then that is completely dependent on who is consuming it. So if you look at and compare the JSONs and the XMLs, right? Fundamentally, they pretty much does the same job, right? But obviously there is a different ways of looking at it, right? So if you look at the XMLs, right, you have child elements and then attributes additionally, right? But if you're coming to JSON, it's only one layer, right? You don't have an attribute kind of a concept. You always have name, value, page kind of stuff, right? So that's a kind of structurally there is a differences, but end of the day, if both are designed for sending an object-oriented information across, right? So it all depends on who's going to consume your API. So there's not this way or that way. It all depends on who's going to consume it. So yeah.
Okay, thank you.
We had a question from Faranak. Should any of these points you have said being as a test case, for example, in Postman? So typically, when I'm doing API testing, essentially there's the endpoint that takes requests and gives me some response. Now, within that, I could have many variations. So I could have obviously positive scenario where I put in the expected request, and then I can have, let's say, missing fields. Like, for example, if a user registration requires username, password, and date of birth, what happens if I leave out the date of birth? What response do I get? Or I could leave it in, but save it as an empty value. Or just have empty values, malformed requests. So normally there's only one way to test an application the right way, but there are hundreds of ways into constructing negative or error scenarios. So each of these can be obviously done in Postman, so that you can make yourself familiarized with how the endpoint functions. But at the same time, you can build up your bigger scenarios where you send a request to an endpoint, fetch the response, get what you want from the response and then feed it as a request to your next request and so forth. So you can do any of these variations, and they form your ultimately they form your suite of tests.
Any more questions?
Yeah, this public APIs, someone is asking about if there are any public APIs. Rapid API gives a lot of things. You'll have some post and get requests as well there to test. That will be ideal to start testing.
Any more questions, guys, or else can we wrap it up?
Cool. Thanks for joining.
Question this side. Hello.
Yeah.
So what exactly is the Swagger? So could you please little bit elaborate, as I'm beginner to the APIs?
Right. Swagger is done with open API standards, right? So when you define your when someone is creating an API, right? So obviously there should be some specifications that you need to look at and see what is my APIs and what are the APIs that are being developed. So Swagger actually sits on top of your development application and just provides an additional UI where it lists all the endpoints to you in one place. In addition to that, on the Swagger, you can also test it with the Swagger by adding a post, creating your request, and you also get a response there. So Swagger, the APIs that's been developed and given exposed to the by the application, right? So yeah, so that's a way of it. In the previous days, it will be WSDL files will be there, where that defines all the APIs that is being exposed by a system. Now with the REST APIs and all coming, right? So now Swagger is taking over that kind of area where it can give us an interface for all the APIs that's been developed by the developer. And it also gives you some sample response, and you can do some documentation in terms of what parameters you can send, and then developers also can follow some annotations so that it automatically, whatever the comments they put in there will automatically come up in this page as a ready to read documents.
And is there any difference between the web service and the API, or both are same? Any practical example you would have?
See, well, it's from a. So, are you asking from a development angle, or are you asking from a testing angle? That all depends, right?
Testing.
Yeah. From a testing point of view, right? At the end of the day, I think you see, I give my request, and I get my response, right? And if API is the same, web service. End of the day, API is also called a web service, right? In a sense, right?
Okay, thank you.
Amir, you want to add a little more to that?
No, all good.
Yeah.
Great then. So I think pretty much that from all of our end. Thanks everyone. Thanks for joining this webinar. So quickly to give a kind of reintroduction, Ram is the founder and product architect of QATTS. Pretty much what we speak about Postman and everything, you can always replace it with QATTS, and we do pretty much on the API testing, web functional, as well as mobile testing. So feel free to come back to our website and look at QATTS.com, and we'll be happy to answer your questions, all you have. And on the other hand, we have Amir. Amir literally translates in Hindi as the rich thing. So he's a content rich guy. You can look at devqa.io. He writes a lot about the testing parts and the rest of other development. I mean, he comes from a combination, both Amir and as well as Ram comes from a combination of product, technology, as well as the testing junction. So that's where both of the things gets very interesting. So yeah, for anything on the testing part or anything, we'll be happy to help you. Feel free to come back to QATTS.com, QATTS.com. Look for us, and you can also go back to devqa.io and read more about Amir's contribution towards the testing and rest of other areas also. Thanks for being a wonderful audience. Have a great evening, great morning to all the time zones people. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Amir.
Bye.